How do we interpret the Bible? It's an important question, and there are some basic questions that we can ask in order to get to the root of how we interpret the Bible and why we interpret certain passages one way and other passages a different way. So that's what we're going to talk about on today's episode of the Science and Faith podcast. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Science and Faith podcast. I'm your host, Mario Russo. Today is a little bit of a special episode. So we're all on holiday here in Germany, and so rather than do a typical episode this week, we're just doing a short episode looking at some common questions that we get in relationship to science and faith and interpreting the Bible, because that seems to be a common theme right now as we engage with you guys over the podcast and in comments and emails and things like that. So how do we interpret the Bible, and why do we interpret certain passages one way and other passages differently? So what I want to do is I just want to give some basic questions today about when you read the Bible, what are some important questions that you need to keep in mind and you need to be asking of the text, okay? So first of all, the first question you want to ask is, who is the author? So who's writing the passage? Who's writing the book that you're reading? Okay, that's very important because the way we interpret the writings of Paul are different from how we interpret the writings of Moses or of the prophets or of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, the experiences of Paul are different from those authors, and so we need to understand who the author is and what kind of perspective he's coming from. You can notice differences when you ask this question between Peter and Paul. So the way Paul writes is very different from the way Peter writes. And so an important question to ask is, who is the author? Who's writing this book? And what are his experiences? What is his world? What's his culture? Where is he coming from? And why? And who is this person that's writing this book? The second question we want to ask is, to whom is this book being written? So who's the audience? Who is the author writing to? Okay, so in some cases, we have the Apostle Paul, who's writing to a church that he's planted. And that church is facing many different obstacles, and they're facing moral issues and leadership issues. And so Paul's addressing those issues in his letter. Versus someone like Peter, who's writing in his letters to people who are facing persecution and suffering. Very often, Paul will talk about his own suffering that he's been through in preaching the gospel, and as a way to communicate his point to his readers. And in the case of Peter, he's writing to people who are in the midst of suffering and persecution. And so we need to look at who is the audience that the author is writing to. That's very important. What issues are they facing? What's the context in which this letter is being delivered? What are the issues that are addressed? Who are the people? What's their culture? What point in history are they facing? What political things are going on? Writing to the church in Rome is different from writing to the church in Corinth or writing to the church in Ephesus. There's different socio-political situations in those cities. And so that's very important. We need to understand what the city of Ephesus is like at the time that this letter was written to them, and what Rome was like at the time that the letter of the Romans was written to. So these are very important questions we need to ask. We also need to ask, so the first two questions are, who's the author and who are they writing to? And then another big important question to ask, number 3, is, how would the people, the audience who received this letter, how would they have interpreted this letter? What would this letter have meant to them? And the way you go about answering that question, again, is by understanding the audience as best as you can. What are the issues that church is facing? What's the political climate like? What's the cultural climate like? What kinds of things do they value that this letter is being written to them? And what corrections are being made? What encouragements are given? What positive affirmations are given in the letter? And what corrections are being made? That's all very, very important to understanding and interpreting the text. And then, of course, lastly, the question you want to ask is, historically speaking, how has this passage been interpreted? So the first place you want to look is in the Bible. So if you're interpreting the Bible, first place you want to look is in the Bible. How do other biblical passages interpret the passages that I'm reading? So, for example, how does Jesus quote the prophets? How does Jesus talk about Moses and the law? So we know who wrote the law. We know how the people of Israel would have received the law. But then we also want to look at what did other contemporaries of that time think about the law? How did they interpret the law? What did Jesus say about these things? And also we want to look at, once you go beyond, when you're looking at the Bible and how other Bible passages treat the passage that you're looking at, then you go beyond that to the historical tradition, to scholars, theologians in the church, and look at historically over 2,000 years, how has the church interpreted these passages? And that provides some very, very important historical context to the passage that you're looking at. So if you kind of survey 2,000 years of historical interpretation of a particular passage, and you've come up with a view that pretty much you're the only one who holds this view, chances are it's probably wrong. And you probably need to think about revising your position. But if you come up with a position that's very, very similar to the historical tradition of the church for 2,000 years, but it's different, it adds a new dimension or a new perspective to that, then chances are you're probably on the right track with your interpretation. It's very easy to want to nail down a black and white answer. This is wrong, this is right, this is truth, this is not truth. And of course we should pursue that. Of course we should pursue the truth. But you want to avoid hardline positions where historically the church hasn't taken hardline positions. So for 2,000 years the church has left it open for interpretation, and you come in and you say, no, this is what it means, this is the right interpretation. Again, chances are you're probably wrong. There's a reason why intelligent men who are filled with the Holy Spirit, just like you are, as a Christian, I assume, as a believer, have for 2,000 years left this particular passage open for interpretation. It would be dangerous 2,000 years later to come in with a new interpretation and say, no, this is the right one, or even suggesting one that's been suggested for 2,000 years and saying all the other views are now excluded, this is the right one. Again, very dangerous position to take. You want to leave it open where the church historically has left it open, because scholars have a very good reason for doing that. The church has a very good reason for doing that, okay? So those are the three big questions you want to ask when you're interpreting a particular passage of the Bible. Who's the author? Who's the audience? And what has the historical interpretation of this passage been? And I think that's a good starting point when you're going to the Bible to interpret a passage, to make sense and to understand it in a good way. If you start with those three questions, and there's lots of other questions you can ask, but if you start with those three questions, I think you're in a good place to come to a reasonably good interpretation of any Bible passage that you choose. So, thanks so much for tuning in. That's our podcast for this week. Again, we're on holiday, so this was just a short podcast. But as always, if you have a question or a comment, send it to us. Leave it in the comment section down below, or you can email it to us, scienceandfaithdortmund@gmail.com. Check out our website. There's resources available there. There's books that are available. There's articles that we publish. So that's easy to read and understand. Scienceandfaith.de, that's our website. And we look forward to being back with you again next time. So stay tuned for the next upcoming episode. And